The Rebel Capitalist Show. What do you think about Richard Werner? And I don't know if you've studied any of his work, but if you have, what do you think of his concept of moving to a model that's much more based around the community and smaller community banks instead of these juggernauts that really only want to pay attention to the big players? What do you think of his idea of doing that? Do you think that's beneficial? If so, why?
Yeah, so I've always believed that the old argument used to be that you need big banks because the scale of the technology that was required to run a bank was, you need mainframes and, 30, 40, 50 years ago, that may have been true, right? And they also argued that basically you could get more capital efficient for being big. Those arguments, I think, are now blown out the water because the technology has completely changed. You can run a bank on a server very easily, right?
Yeah.
And what you've missed is the close proximity to the community. And my father was a bank manager, right? And he was along with the vicar, he was actually one of the pillars of the local community, right? When he was a bank manager years and years ago, right? And he was horrified when he saw these banks getting bigger and bigger and more distant from the local community. He couldn't make decisions towards the end of his career to support local businesses. He had to go upstairs to be able to actually seek permission to make the loan, right? And he could see this whole thing becoming a marketing, centralized, controlled thing, right? And in the process, he said to me, towards the end of his career, I can't do what I used to do, which was to help the local community. So we have to find a way back to aligning, the local community to the finance that it needs, I think. And so I'm a great supporter of from the ground up, right? Community banking and those sorts of things. Now, there are risks that you have to, cope with, and you have to recognize that there are standards that need to be adopted in terms of risk management process and things. But fundamentally, bigger is not better in banking, in my view, these days. And interestingly, if you think about how banking is now delivered, which is predominantly through the internet, right? The distancing between the decision makers and the people who actually need the funds is getting more and more and more distant rather than actually less. I think we're missing a really important point. So I think Rich is onto something.
Yeah, I just go back to my own experience. In 2012, I retired. And if you looked at my personal balance sheet back then, it was incredibly strong from a standpoint of a borrower. And I was buying a lot of homes in the Midwest at that time when they were just pennies, and I was just paying cash for them. And so all the properties I owned, I owned outright. And unbelievably, it was very hard for me to go to a bank and, number one, even get a mortgage to buy a property, or to even take out the equity that I had in one of these properties that I owned outright at like a 50% LTV, to buy more property or to do whatever. And so it's weird that, especially when banks get this large, it seems as though they lend when they shouldn't be lending. And then they pull back lending when they actually should, when there's less risk because the market has bottomed out. But my point is, at the beginning, I just couldn't get anybody to give me a loan. And finally, I met a small community bank there. I met the vice president of commercial lending, and we went out for lunch a few times. I told him the problems that I was having of getting anyone to even pay attention to me at all. I said, look at my balance sheet. I'm like, look at all these houses I own. Look at the cash. Look at how much money I've made over the past, 10 years or whatever. And he's like, yeah, it's just the environment right now. But he got to know me. He's like, listen, here's the line of credit. Here's whatever you want. I ended up not even really using it to a large degree. But since that time, I've gotten to know him very well. And now whenever I go back to Kansas City, we have dinner, we go to lunch, we grab coffee or whatever. And now I know darn well that if we went into another downturn, that I'd pretty much be able to borrow whatever I wanted to borrow because I've established that relationship. And he's made a lot of money on me in the past because every once in a while I'll use that line of credit, or I'll use his bank for borrowing. But my main point is I was able to build that relationship with him So now there's that trust. And if we don't have these community banks, if everything is a Wells Fargo or whatever the equivalent is in Australia, there's never going to be those relationships. You're always just going to be a number, and then it's just going to go to risk management where they're just going to calculate some things and check some boxes, and you either get the loan or you don't based on these boxes, instead of getting a loan based on a handshake and going to dinner with that person, looking them in the eye and saying, hey, is this guy or gal someone that I want to take a risk on, yes or no, based on human interaction?
Yeah, well, I agree absolutely. And, I survey SMEs all the time here in Australia. Half of the SMEs say to me they cannot get the support and finance and funding that they need, right? Half of them, right? So basically, there is a throttle on the momentum in the small and medium enterprise sector in Australia that is actually credit led. In fact, I made a submission to Parliament quite recently saying there has to be a different funding model to enable small businesses to do what they want to do, because the banking system doesn't support them. And it's for that reason that you said, because the bank wants cookie cutters, right? The bank wants to be able to say, tick, 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 tick. Yep, it's a mortgage. Yep, fine, go. Right.
Exactly.
And they can automate that, and they can reduce the human interaction through the process, and basically just turn it into an automated process. And you apply online, and you get the money, and nobody even thinks about it. Right. That's the future of banking that they want, because it's efficient, and the capital ratios, etc., control that mode of operation. But I would argue that the true future of banking is exactly what you're saying, where people actually have interactions and people get to know, what's actually driving that particular business. There are lots of businesses in Australia with great ideas that just cannot get the funding. And I think this is probably one of the most critical discussions to have, because, there are businesses today that could become massive businesses tomorrow, and yet they never get off the ground because the systems don't allow them to get off the ground. And the way that the banking system works in Australia is it's becoming more and more and more, a juggernaut, or a small series of juggernauts, actually all competing for the same business, all competing for and if you're above a certain scale, you might be able to get some loans. But if you're a smaller business and you've got something, that actually needs some help, and often you do, you need some finance to be able to get through, particularly now. Yeah, that there's a huge gap, and unfortunately, more and more of even the small players are getting consolidated and aggregated into larger players. And as they do that, they lose that community connection, and I think it's a real problem.
Yeah, and the small and mid-sized enterprises are the ones that could grow and diversify the economies to where you weren't so dependent upon that one pillar of real estate.
Very interestingly, I was contacted the other day by somebody very senior in a very well-known, I won't mention the name, company in Australia, who actually is in the technology space, and they said they've been watching what I do on my channel, and they want to work with me because I get the innovation thing. I get the need to be able to shift the conversation to a different place, and they want to basically be involved in that conversation. So I'm going to get the CEO to come on down the track, and we're going to actually talk about what it's like to try and actually drive a business forward, and how hard it is in Australia, because that they see and I see that we are missing the opportunity that there is if only we could shift the thinking, right? And that's, again, partly a political thing. It's partly a structural thing. It's partly a financing thing. But actually, this is so critical for the future of Australia, because if we don't have those innovators creating those businesses and making them into bigger businesses that actually can create more value, all you're doing is chasing the same dollar around the system. And unfortunately, eventually that dollar goes into aged care or health care or whatever else, but it's just the same dollar. We need more dollars going around the system.
Yeah, that's right. How do you see regulation playing into that?
Well, I think in Australia we have huge amounts of regulation. We have red tape, wrapped in red tape, frankly.
Yeah.
They do not make it easy, frankly, to run a business, right? And it's all down about tax integrity, and all those sorts of things. There's always the reasons why it's the way it is. But no, there is a real problem here in terms of the cultural norms that are being imposed on particularly small businesses, right? Because those barriers really get in the way. And every time you go to try to do something, you trip over more rules and regulations. I come from the UK, right? And I came out, and in the UK, I was always somebody who said, well, it's, you want a few rules, but you don't want too many rules. I came to Australia, and it was like, everything's got rules, right?
Yeah.
Thou shalt, you can't do, you'll be fined if you, it's it's an amazingly controlled environment here. And yet people who have lived in Australia all their lives just think, well, isn't that the way it always is? No, it doesn't have to be like this, right? So I think there's an opportunity there to really think hard about where you need regulation and support, and where you can actually allow the market to, expand and develop without too many controls. But at the moment, the hurdles in front of people to be able to actually do anything are just, horrible.